Let's begin actually today in Matthew 24 and verse 9, verse 10. So I'm going to start off right off the bat here. And kind of breaking into a thought, Matthew 24. "In this they shall deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then many shall be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another." Be offended. Let's think about that a little bit. What is it to be offended? In the end time, we know this will come about, and there's lots of reasons. You can go look out on the news today, and you can see what's going on with ISIS and these groups of Christians that are being slaughtered weekly, it seems like. Persecution's coming, and many shall be offended. I'll look into that a little bit more with you all this afternoon. So the word offended is the Greek word G4624, if you have your Strongs or your concordance. It's scandalizio. It's a verb. It's to put a stumbling block or an impediment in the way, to entice to sin, to cause a person to distrust or desert one whom he ought to trust and obey, to fall away, to be offended, to cause one to judge unfavorably or unjustly. This comes from the word 4625, which is scandalon, which is a noun which is a movable sticker or a trap stick, a snare. But it's also applied to Jesus Christ in this verse, or in this definition here, whose career and person were contrary to the expectations of the Jews at that time. Let's go and see how this word is actually used in the Bible. Let's go to Mark 4, and there's a section there, it's the parable of the sower, verses 1 through 20. I'm going to break into that, because we know the parable of the sower. We've read it 1,000 times. And we'll begin in verse 9. "And he said to them, He that has ears to hear, let him hear. And he was alone, that they may about him with the 12 to ask him of the parable. And he said to them, Unto you it is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God, but unto them that are without, these things are done in parables, that seeing they may see, and not perceive, and hearing they may hear, and not understand, lest at any time they should be converted, and their sins should be forgiven them. And he said unto them, Know ye not this parable? And how will ye know all parables? The sower soweth the word. And these are they by the wayside, where the word is sown. And when they have heard, Satan cometh immediately, and taketh them away with the word that was sown in their hearts. And these are they likewise which are sown on stony ground, who, when they have heard the word, immediately receive it with gladness, and have no root in themselves, and so endure for a time afterward. And when affliction and persecution arises for the word's sake, immediately they are offended." Scandalon. So those without roots, sown on rocky ground, are immediately offended. So something challenged them, something pushed them, and they became offended because they had no root in themselves. Let's go again and look at another verse here. Mark 14, it's been 27 to 29. In verse 27, "Jesus saith unto them, And ye shall be offended because of me this night. For it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after that I am risen, I will go before you into Galilee. And Peter said unto him, Although all shall be offended, will not I?" The same word, offended, the disciples were offended that night. What happened to them? They were scattered. That's the Greek word diasporizio, which is to scatter abroad, to gather the wheat, free the chaff. So they were offended. And what happened when they were offended? They scattered. Matthew 26 and verse 31 is the similar passage. So to be offended is to be scattered, to easily uprooted, to have a stumbling block placed in your way, perhaps. Now, we're not talking about being offensive. We're talking about being offended. Talking about your heart. So we're beginning to see this word take a little bit more shape now, aren't we? Offended is kind of a lack of depth, if you want to look at it in that way. If you're offended, you have a lack of conviction, of courage, commitment. Perhaps it's your own weaknesses and faults that's causing you to be offended. Is that your pride coming first? Maybe it's a lack of being prepared, and your roots aren't quite deep enough like they should be. So an offended then leads you to be scattered. So offended and scattered. Your mind, your focus, maybe just you're distracted like crazy. You're without shape, you're easily offended. So at first blush, we think, well, offended, this is negative. This is not a good thing. So let's flip this a second and look at it from a different perspective. Is Jesus Christ offending us? I don't get offended by that statement, but let's think about it. Is Jesus Christ doing something to scatter within us? Is he trying to place a stumbling block somewhere in our life to get us to stop doing what we are doing currently? To stop us from giving something in our lives that we want? Is he trying to make his way of life, make us live his way of life and not our own way of life? Is that making us uncomfortable when we think about that a little bit? It does to me. Jesus, he offended the Pharisees. If you go back and look at, he went up there and he offended their traditions, correct? Their religion, their traditions have become more important to them than the Torah was supposed to be. Let's look at that in our own little microcosm of our world today. When are we not advancing enough that we can understand and not be offended? As we're maturing, as we're growing as Christians, are we still being offended by Christ? Are we finding things in our life that we maybe need to change? Are we offended by reading something in the Bible that we hadn't really realized before? Or maybe we've developed our own traditions. Maybe our own traditions are leading us to get offended when we kind of rub those wrong. So I'm going to take a simple example, and we're just going to play with this. Maybe you don't like having real unleavened bread at Passover and like having matzos. That's a tradition. My tradition, I grew up in most of the places where I kept Passover, was always real unleavened bread. Does one or the other offend you? That's a tradition. It's a kind of a silly example, as we all know. We can expand that. The format we sing every day, three hymns, and then the prayer. Why not the prayer first and 3 hymns? Is that a tradition? Do we get offended by the idea of changing that? We can go into any little thing that we've been doing for a year, 6 months, 50 years, 60 years. Maybe we should be looking to be offended and be willing to be offended. Because if we're never offended, maybe we're complacent, maybe we're asleep, maybe we're just lukewarm. When I think of that, I think of I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Gladiator, or most of you have. And Gladiators, talks about he's attacking, they're attacking the other camp, and they're going to do the battle. And he tells his warriors, if you find yourself walking in fields of wheat and it's peaceful, for fear not, you're already dead. I kind of apply that to the situation. If you're not being offended, if you're not battling, maybe you're already dead. That was interesting. So I'm not going to stay out and try to be offending people. Don't be offensive to people. Don't out there and put stumbling blocks in people's ways. But look at it yourself. How do you overcome being offended? So 1, stop being offended. Grow up. This is where we kind of have to accept meat and not just milk. I think Paul talks about that somewhere a number of times. Maybe we just need to actually chew on some steak and put away the breastfeeding that we've been doing for years. Chew on what God's trying to put before us. This is being mature. This is having a flesh of heart, or a heart of flesh, not stone, where you're able to kind of look at things and chew on it. Eating mature meat that we have to kind of savor and appreciate to really understand it maybe. Number 2, ask, why am I offended? And ask God to show you why. So get on your knees, or sit down, or whatever you do, pray, ask, what are your motives that are causing you to be offended? Don't worry about whoever may be offending you. Why are you offended? What are your reasons for interpreting whatever given situation it is? Is it, I'm just comfortable this is the way my mind's programmed? Maybe whatever that wasn't intended to offend you in the first place. Maybe it had nothing to do with you, but you got upset about it. Respect each other, trust each other, and try to understand each other. I think it's agape, if we kind of put that into another term. Pray and apply those fundamental biblical principles that are applying agape into your life, doing what is best for the other person. You got to look at yourself to understand who you are. And then number 3, challenge yourself. Look at yourself, challenge your own personal inner self, challenge your habits, challenge your assumptions. Are we looking for places in our lives where we should be offended? Are we looking for places in our life where we should be challenged a little bit? Are we looking for places in our lives, maybe I don't want to give that up because I like that? Why? Maybe it's a good godly principle you've based it upon. Maybe it's just the way you've kind of gotten stuck in a rut. I got a few ruts. When we come back and we're standing before Jesus, metaphorically, physically, however you want to be, when you're at that point in time when you're becoming a spirit being and Christ says, okay, this is what we're going to do, are you going to look at him and go, yeah, but we've always done it this way? There's a great story that I love. If Christ was, he's not, but if he was a giant purple octopus in space, and when he came in, you looked at him, he was a purple octopus, would you argue with him? It's an absurd example, but it's real though, right? Mark 9 and verse 42 to verse 47. And I'm not going to read all this because we're getting short on time, but if your hand, if your foot, if your eye offends you, it causes you to be scattered, if it causes you to be cast about, to have a stumbling block put in your way, again, it's your hand, it's your foot, it's your eye. What do you do with it? You cut it off. It may be easy to cut off a hand and get by. Maybe then you can't do the work of God, you feel, so I don't want to cut off that hand because I can't do that work. I don't want to cut off my foot because then I can't move forward after God and I can't follow his ways. I don't want to take out an eye. I mean, that's part of who I am. That's my person, my inner being. You can't see where you're going if you cut out an eye. But if it's offending you, maybe you need to cut it out. In Luke 7 and verse 22. And Jesus answered them and told them, "Go and tell John the things you have seen and heard, that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are clean, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who is not offended, who is not scandalizio, who is not scattered because of me." If your hand cuts you, the blind see, the lame walk. I'm just putting those together when I was kind of building this message. That was an interesting parallel. So to be offended is to be without deep roots on rocky ground. It's to be scattered. But to be offended is to grow. To be offended is to be challenged. It's to question your inner man, your inner woman. It's to sharpen your iron with somebody else. To be offended, be challenged, grow.